So hello and welcome to another episode of Biographics. I'm your interim host, Carl Smallwood. That's Carl with a K, Smallwood, quite unfortunately, with a small and then a wood. Yes, it's really spelled like that. Let's move on. And today we're talking about John C.H. Lee, the forgotten mastermind of World War II. And something I like to point out in Biographics, Geographics and Top 10s videos is that these videos are a team effort. Sure, I'm the person you see in front of you on screen right now, but I'm by no means the only person working on these videos. In fact, at least half a dozen people's eyeballs will be laid upon the original script before I even get my hands on it. And the first person to see it is, of course, the original author, who in this case is Larry Holsworth. Follow them at the social media links found below. But let's get to it. The history of the United States Army presents no shortage of what may be called colourful characters, to put it diplomatically, who adorned its ranks and accomplishments. During the American Revolutionary War, for example, there was the rambunctious Ethan Allen, loud, profane and self-serving. The American Civil War produced George Armstrong Custer, one of the earliest examples of an army commander retaining a press correspondent on his personal staff. World War I produced MacArthur, as well as the equally flamboyant George Patton, both of whom used lessons learned in that conflict to further their fame during World War II. These officers and many others of similar bent shared a personal notoriety and military success. Another, a contemporary of MacArthur, Patton, Dwight Eisenhower and other military leaders of the Second World War was John Clifford Hodges Lee, whose contributions to the Allied victory was substantial but whose efforts are largely forgotten. And I'm aware, as someone who's been making content online for a decade, that World War II videos are especially popular. So we're using the term forgotten here in a relative sense. So he may be well known by history buffs and those who love to consume World War II related content, but to the wider public, this man's contributions to the war effort, which were substantial, as we'll cover, are largely glossed over and not really covered in the quick retellings of World War II people would get in, say, a history class. So let's correct that, shall we? So Lee had the often rather thankless task of ensuring troops were fed, clothed and armed and supported by the medical and staff personnel. Rather than leading them into battle, it was his responsibility to have trained replacements ready to step forward when needed. Fuel available to support offensives, bullets for rifles, shells for tanks and mail delivered to the men on the front. Engineers to support combat operations and build necessary roads, storage sites, fuel dumps, airfields, other military infrastructure, all of these were under his control. In accomplishing his task, he developed the reputation of being something of a self-absorbed ass. Among his troops, including the senior officers deployed in Europe, his initials, JCH, were said to stand for Jesus Christ himself. In Citizen Soldiers, the noted historian Stephen Ambrose described him as, and I quote, the biggest jerk in the European theatre of operations who had an exalted opinion of himself. Yet, without the successful execution of his duties, the Allied drive across Europe would have been immeasurably more difficult. They wouldn't have had fuel, bullets or shells. Come on. He is an interesting, complicated and often comic figure who alienated his superiors as well as the men underneath his immediate command. Yet he got the job done. According to Eisenhower, who said of him, and I quote, I thought it was possible that his unyielding methods be vital to success in activity where an iron hand is always mandatory. But we have to start, as we often like to do, at the beginning with born in Junction City, Kansas in 1887, the young Lee proved to be an excellent student, graduating second in his class in high school in 1905. Although he planned to enter the Colorado School of Mines, he instead accepted an appointment as first alternate to the United States Military Academy, entering the class of 1909. He graduated 12th in his class, and an interesting insight into his reputation within the US Army can be gleaned from the United States Military Academy's website, which lists notable graduates for numerous classes throughout its history. For the class of 1909, it lists George S. Patton Jr., who was 46th in his class that year. Lee is not mentioned at all. Graduates with high academic standing were often offered enrolment in the prestigious US Army Corps of Engineers, and it was that branch of service which drew the attention of young Lieutenant Lee. The Corps of Engineers was tasked with developing, improving and maintaining the navigable waterways and ports of the United States and its possessions, among its many, many other duties, and it was in that area where Lee's military career began. He worked at posts in Michigan, in Panama and Pennsylvania, with temporary assignments for further training at various posts. In the 1910s, for example, his assignments included further posts in the Philippines, in Guam, in the Mexican-Texas border, and along the Ohio River dams while based in Wheeling, West Virginia, among many, many others. His reputation as both an engineer and a soldier drew the attention and eventual patronage of senior officers, including Major General Leonard Wood. It's no small wood though, is it? By 1916, Lee had been promoted to captain, published a field manual titled Manual for Topographers, and supervised the completion of a major navigational dam on the Ohio River below Wheeling. That year, he was assigned an aide-de-camp to General Wood, former Chief of Staff, the US Army, and then Commander of the Eastern Department. When the United States declared war on Germany in 1917, Wood was the leading candidate for command of the American Expeditionary Forces. Wood's previously uttered criticisms of Wilson's administration led President Wilson to select John L. Pershing in his stead. Wood accepted command of the newly formed 89th Division Army of the United States in Kansas. Lee remained with his mentor until February 1918 when he departed for France and served as an intelligence officer with the 82nd Division. He saw combat in several patrols before returning to the 89th upon its arrival in France that summer as its operations officer. Lee took part in the major offensives launched by the Allies in the summer of 1918 and received several commendations and awards, including, but not limited to, the Distinguished Service Medal, the Legion of Honor, and the Silver Star. By the war's end, he was a temporary colonel, but more on that in a moment. In the aftermath of World War I, the American military rapidly demobilized and wartime promotions, often called brevets in many cases, were reversed. In Lee's case, he reverted to his pre-war rank of captain and returned to the peacetime cycle of active duty deployments interspersed with training periods. He served again in the Philippines and on the American mainland. In 1926, he held the post of Army Corps of Engineers District Engineer in Vicksburg, Mississippi, when the catastrophic floods of that and the following year decimated the central United States. Floods destroyed some 16 million acres, over 9,000 homes, and damaged more than 16,000 homes and businesses. Lee spearheaded the relief and recovery efforts, directed evacuations, and bolstered levees throughout the watershed to minimize damages. Following the disaster, Congress passed the Flood Control Act of 1928, and Lee was responsible for the resulting flood control projects on tributaries of the Mississippi and Missouri rivers. After training at the Army War College and Army Industrial College, he served as the district engineer of the Washington District, responsible for improvements to the river and associated waterways therein. By the fall of 1940, Lee held the rank of Brigadier General with an impressive resume of engineering projects and other programs successfully completed during his career. He also had considerable combat experience in Europe and the Philippines, numerous advanced training certificates, and command experience at the division level. He enjoyed the respect of senior Army officers including George C. Marshall and Leslie McNair. When the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor in December 1941, Lee was in command of the US Army 2nd Infantry Division. His performance, bringing that formerly underperforming unit up to standards, led to his promotion to Major General in February 1942. It also led to a call to Washington. In the early months of World War II, the Americans and their British allies developed a policy of defeating Nazi Germany as a priority over defeating Japan, in part because it allowed them to take advantage of the Soviets' war effort with the Germans. An invasion of France was envisioned as early as summer 1942, launched from England to the French beaches. Known as, get this, Operation Sledgehammer, it demanded a rapid build-up of American forces and equipment in Britain, a separate project designated as Operation Bolero. So, they probably took a day off when naming that one. In May 1942, the US Army Chief of Staff, George Marshall, and Lieutenant General Bretton Somerville, the Commanding General Service of Supply, selected Lee as the Commanding General Service of Supply of the US Army Forces in the British Isles. Lee's new task included 2 weeks of meetings in Washington with his British liaison counterparts, after which he was to transfer to the United Kingdom proper. Lee's mission was, to put it simply, formidable. He was to establish the command responsible for the many hundreds of bases, supply depots, warehouses, piers, rail networks, trucks, airfields, and airplane storage facilities, fuel tank necessary to support the massive build of an American military presence in the United Kingdom. All of that good stuff. So he was to start from scratch without even a competent staff to assist him at the outset. He was in the UK. Burn on us. The overall operation, including the movement of troops, was called Operation Roundup, quite fittingly. Its initial goal was a cross-channel invasion of Europe by late 1942. Upon arrival in the United Kingdom, Lee faced not only the enormity of the task itself, but the lack of a location from which he could direct its operations. The rapidly expanding American military presence in Great Britain, including a hodgepodge of commands, overlapping areas of responsibility, and resentment among its many commanders towards their contemporaries, resulted in just a lot of faff going on. For example, competition for quarters in London, seemingly a trivial detail but a sign of status for the generals, was fierce. Lee's initial task was to organise the Service of Supply, henceforth shortened to SOS, quite fitting I should say, for the newly designated European Theatre of Operations, henceforth shortened to the ETO. Actually no, I'll say European Theatre of Operations because it's it sounds so much more grand. After briefly occupying spaces in London, Lee selected Cheltenham, approximately 140 kilometres west of the city, as its headquarters. He justified this decision as being more convenient to the sites of the large number of bases and supply depots proposed for the south of England. He also acquired a private train to expedite his travel across the country. It consisted of a private car for the general, 2 for his immediate staff, another car set up as a conference and communications hub, a dining car and a pair of flat cars to carry things like automobiles and other vehicles, including a military ambulance that was fully stocked. Lee designated 4 regions within the United Kingdom, assigned sub-commanders to each, and embarked upon a tour of sites proposed to house forthcoming American units. He toured ports to assess their facilities, rail networks, warehouses, and sites for fuel depots. While other commanders grumbled about his extravagance, Lee maintained what was described as a grueling pace, at least according to some of the staff which accompanied him. The train ran mostly at night, the daylight hours filled with inspections, meetings, and conferences. According to one biographer, Roland G. Ruppenthal, most of the staff who accompanied the SOS commander considered the trips agonizing ordeals and would have avoided them if possible. But they couldn't. Lee's justification of his private train and other eyebrow-raising activities was based on the broad authority granted to him via the creation of the SOS itself. He was provided the authority to approve all civilian contracts which impacted the mission of the SOS. He could, if he so chose, hire any and all civilians necessary to his mission, set their rate of compensation without regard to civil service regulations, purchase supplies, property, equipment, vehicles, foodstuffs, and pretty much anything else he deemed necessary without resorting to a higher authority. He was in effect handed a blank check. And that mission was, broadly, to ensure that Americans deployed in the European theatre of war were housed, fed, clothed, armed, regularly paid, had access to medical care, and access to recreational facilities and activities. In regards to that latter one, that might sound like a fairly trivial thing compared to, clothing, housing, and the guns with which to shoot the Germans, but it's an anecdote at the very least of people have probably heard, at least if you've consumed a lot of content about World War II, that America during World War II maintained ice cream ships. These were essentially just ships that provided supplies for other ships, including ice cream, which seems like a ridiculous extravagance in the theatre of war. But there were interviews with Japanese commanders after the fact, and they described it as being just morale crushing to see American forces effectively waste valuable resources for an extravagance that wasn't necessary purely to keep the troops' morale up. And yeah, but that's a story for another day. Let's get back to Lee. So his broad powers came at the expense of other theatre commanders, most of whom resented the fact that supply issues for the troops under their command came under the jurisdiction of an outside, at least to them, authority. At the outset of the American efforts in Europe, Lee held the authority equal to, but outside that, of the commander of the entire European theatre of war. American forces were divided into 3 major commands: ground, air, and supply. Bureaucratic infighting between the commands began almost immediately and continued throughout the war. Yeah, bureaucracy never stops. Lee remained imperious, guarding his authority and autonomy quite fiercely despite pressures inflicted upon him, particularly from the Army Air Forces, as the bombing campaign against Hitler's Germany grew in size and importance. He made enemies, and his perceived extravagances, such as his frequent travel via private train, were cited as indicative of his idiosyncratic nature. Yet, Eisenhower developed something of a begrudging respect for his professional abilities and defended him to critics. By the end of June, it was apparent to Allied commanders that a second front in Europe via cross-channel invasion of France was logistically impossible in 1942. Yet, demands of the Soviet Union for Anglo-British forces engaging the Germans directly made some action politically necessary. An invasion of North Africa via the Vichy French colonies was decided upon in that regard. Operation Torch replaced plans for an invasion of Europe, and Lee found himself tasked with supporting a seaborne invasion in the Mediterranean, something he hadn't been preparing for. Lee faced shortages of virtually everything necessary to accomplishing this task, including ships to transport the men and materials in the first place. The invasion of North Africa was scheduled for November 1942, and by late summer, Lee's SOS remained severely undermanned, and the logistics situation was critical. Without time to build storage facilities, his men had to rely on the British, who used an inventory control system that Americans were unfamiliar with. We are an idiosyncratic people, and I'm guessing our insistence on the use of imperial units in some cases probably resulted in a lot of arguments between American and British forces. That's a story for another day. But This resulted in many supplies arriving in Britain and promptly vanishing into thin air. Many were incorrectly labelled or not labelled at all, resulting in them just disappearing or not being used for the purpose they were earmarked for. In August, Lee learned that the US 1st Infantry Division, earmarked for Torch, had yet to receive any of its organisational equipment, which remained in storage back in New York. Eisenhower, who had previously recommended that Lee relieve him as commander when he departed to command Torch, withdrew his recommendation and pressed Lee hard. The latter responded, shipping over 400,000 tons of supplies and equipment to North Africa in the autumn of 1942 alone. In early 1943, Lee enrolled in aerial gunnery training, doing so purely to fly to North Africa in an American bomber rather than as a mere passenger. During his trip, he met with British and American commanders, including Bernard Montgomery and General Patton, to discuss their supply issues, of which there were many. Though Montgomery and Patton were known for their, shall we say, flamboyant appearance, the latter favouring a highly polished helmet and riding pants and boots combo, the former a bush hat and umbrella, to explain, Lee insisted upon a formal military appearance and absolute precision in himself in regards to that appearance and his staff at all times. This fueled some resentment among his operational commanders, including General Omar Bradley, who pressured Patton to demand control of his own supply system. Patton got nowhere with Eisenhower on that subject, and service of supply remained firmly under Lee's dutiful command. When Eisenhower left the position of commander of the European Theatre of War, it was assigned to Lieutenant General Frank Andrews. Now, Andrews had ordered Lee to relocate his SOS headquarters to London. General Andrews was not a fan of the SOS commander, in part because of Lee's deep religious beliefs. Lee habitually attended church daily. Although he did not demand that his men did the same, it was obvious that he'd prefer if they did. Andrews considered Lee to be, and I quote, oppressively religious. He intended to have Lee recalled to Washington, but Andrews was unfortunately killed in an airplane crash before he could do so. Instead, Lee was promoted, assuming command of what grew to be 220,000 SOS troops in Britain alone. The build-up for this cross-channel invasion, then designated Operation Overlord, there goes America with the super awesome naming conventions once again, and scheduled for 1944, required an enormous increase in supplies and service units. Among these were engineering units which would be required to build the shipping and storage sites necessary to support offensive operations in France. SOS was redesignated as the Communications Zone, COMZ, once Overlord was underway, and Lee was assigned as its commander. He was also promoted once again in February 1944 to the rank of Lieutenant General. He immediately adopted the curious habit of wearing his 3-star symbol of rank on both the front and back of his helmet. This idiosyncrasy led to him being somewhat derisively referred to as a 6-star general. This also fed the resentment of Bradley, Patton, Montgomery and others. Eisenhower, who had returned to Britain to assume command of Overlord and Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Forces, Scaife had no shortage of colourful individuals under his command and tolerated them as long as they performed their duties as described. Another general that Lee clashed with during the build-up for the invasion was Walter Bedell Smith, Ike's chief of staff. Smith resented the fact that Lee could, and did, interfere with combat operations by control of supplies. Lee's control of supplies, particularly fuel, which, as you might imagine, was of critical importance, allowed him to exert influence on the schedule of operations, a major source of resentment among operational commanders. Almost all of them wanted higher priorities for supplies than those assigned by Lee. Yet Eisenhower respected Lee's abilities as both an administrator and a leader, and Lee continued to exert control as Overlord unfolded. During the build-up to the Allied invasions, the Americans and British bombing raids destroyed much of the railway infrastructure across Europe, and in order to support the Allied drive across France, those railroads would need to be rebuilt. A shortage of engineer battalions, as well as the necessary materials required to rebuild railways, made rebuilding a daunting, if not impossible, task. Lee responded with an innovation which alienated him from, shall we say, less open-minded leaders. As Allied divisions moved across France in 1944, they did so to a tune of about 750 tons of supplies per division per day. Overall, the advancing Allies consumed about 21,000 tons daily, much of it fuel. With the rail networks in shambles, thanks to the aforementioned bombing efforts, the only means of advancing supplies arriving at the Normandy beaches was by truck. COMSI responded by creating what they called the Red Ball Express, a system of truck convoys which, at its peak in 1944, moved some 12,000 tons of supplies and equipment daily from Normandy beaches to the combat front lines. Lee, as mentioned, raised some eyebrows by staffing his trucks with primarily black American troops, alleviating the shortage of personnel caused by other operations. His drivers willingly overloaded their trucks, ensuring they carried the absolute maximum possible load without regard to the established safety and weight limits. They also removed the speed governors intended to limit the speed at which they traversed the narrow French roads. By removing these governors, the trucks could travel as fast as 90 kilometers per hour, 70 miles per hour for anyone curious, traveling in convoys of 5 with military police jeeps serving as escorts. Although officially Red Ball Express trucks were only to travel in convoys for safety, in practice many made their runs alone, driven by the expediency of supply shortages. In August 1944, Lee moved COMSI headquarters to France, first in a temporary encampment near Normandy, then on September 1st to Paris. He established his residence at the Hotel George V, and gradually his command occupied over 200 Paris hotels and other buildings. The opulence of his personal quarters and his sprawling spider web of staff further resentment among field commanders, and Eisenhower expressed his displeasure through Bedell-Smith. Lee justified his move as being wholly necessary, placing him closer to his operations, but critically allowing him to maintain communications with all area commanders and his supply systems. Once again, Eisenhower acquiesced. The success of the Red Ball Express and its critical, near essential role in maintaining fighting efficiency gave Lee considerable influence, though not as much as he maybe would have liked. In November 1944, the Belgian port of Antwerp finally opened to support the Allied troops, and the need for the Red Ball Express came to an end. Following a German counterattack in December 1944, known to history as the Battle of the Bulge, heavy casualties necessitated an increase in replacements. Lee advocated allowing black volunteers for combat duty, both in segregated units and as replacements in fully integrated units. Just a reminder, history really sucks sometimes. Lee once again found an adversary in the form of Bedell-Smith, who disagreed with the idea of integrated units. They were fighting the Nazis, and recommended that black troops be assigned together as full platoons and incorporated within the combat command as such. Smith wrote to Eisenhower, and I hate doing quotes like this, but it's important to remember history, so Lee believes that it is right that coloured and white soldiers should be mixed in the same company. With this belief, I do not argue, but War Department policy is different. In the end, Smith's views prevailed and black combat troops remained segregated at the platoon level. Let's just move on. Following the end of combat operations in Europe, COMSI was redesignated as the Theatre Service Forces, with Lee commanding it from occupied Frankfurt. In December, he became the Deputy Theatre Commander and relocated to Italy, where he became the commander of the entire Mediterranean Theatre of Operations. In that role, he was instrumental in the repatriation of American troops and in rebuilding the damaged infrastructure in Italy, southern France, Greece, and other nations in the region that had been bombed. He again became the subject of some controversy when a series of newspaper articles authored by syndicated columnist Robert C. Ruark accused him of using enlisted men for personal services, as well as hiring them out to local contractors. He also accused Lee of living a lavish lifestyle at the expense of the American taxpayer. Lee returned to the United States in August 1947, but not before demanding a full Inspector General's investigation into his own activities while in occupied Italy. The Inspector General's investigation exonerated him fully of any and all wrongdoing, but the damage to his reputation remained. Lee retired from the Army as Lieutenant General after 38 years of dutiful service in December 1947. He spent his retirement serving as the Executive Vice President and later the President of the Brotherhood of St. Andrew, a Episcopalian lay organisation dedicated to regular study and dissemination of Scripture. He died in 1958 and was buried at Arlington National Cemetery. History has, shall we say, not being kind to John C.H. Lee. He stands largely forgotten among the popular histories of World War II, though his contributions to Allied victory were huge and, some would say, critical. Omar Bradley called Lee, and I quote, an unfortunate pomposity. The aforementioned Stephen Ambrose went so far as to imply COMSI created the black market in American supplies in Paris in 1944. Then we have Roman Ruppenthal, an official US Army historian, who wrote that Lee, and I quote, often aroused suspicions and created opposition where support may have been forthcoming. Yet, the Allied troops which fought across North Africa and Europe were, for the most part, well supplied and supported by the logistic train established and supported by Lee and the men under his command. All told, over 41 million tons of supplies were landed in Europe and transferred transported to where they needed to be as Allies drove to Germany. The effort, to not undersell it, was Herculean, and the credit for its success goes largely to John C.H. Lee, the forgotten mastermind of World War II. So thank you to everyone for watching this video. I would like to apologise. I am on the tail end of a cold, so perhaps the timbre and cadence of my voice is not exactly great for recounting the story of someone who was critical to success during World War II, so hopefully people can forgive me for that one. And I would also like to apologise for any mispronunciations and things like that. I do try to do my due diligence before recording, but I would also I think that voice crack says it all. That voice crack says it all. Leave that in. Leave that in. That's what I've been trying to struggle with all day while recording. Thank you to everyone for watching at home. I hope you found this video to be enjoyable, entertaining, and informative. I certainly found the script to be all three of those things. And if you are inclined to agree, you can go let the author, Larry Holdsworth, know that you enjoyed their work at the social media links provided below. Thanks as always to everyone watching. Like the video, comment, feedback, suggestions, all that good stuff. Subscribe for more content like this. And as I always like to say, go out there and have the day that you deserve. Man, I'm so bad at this lately. You would not think this has been my job for the past 7 years. Cheers, everybody. Have a great day.